Welcome to the Pure Passion Podcast with Dr. David Kyle Foster. This podcast and our many other resources are made possible by our donors. Please support this ministry by going to our website, masteringlife.org.
Well, welcome to Pure Passion. I'm so glad that you've tuned in. Today we have a wonderful guest. Her name is Ruth Graham, and she has got Ruth Graham Ministries. Am I right about that?
That's correct.
And what's the website for that?
RuthGraham.com.
RuthGraham.com. We've had Ruth on when we had a TV show, we've had Ruth on before, and just a wonderful amount of information and blessing to all those who watched it or listened to it. Today, we're going to talk about loneliness, which is the subject of Ruth's new book. And I want to begin by quoting Eleanor Rigby, which is a song that's perfect for her book. It's by the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney. And it goes, Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. She lives in a dream, waits in the window, wearing the face that she kept in a jar by the door. Who is it for? All the lonely people, where do they all come from? All the lonely people, where do they all belong? Father Mackenzie, writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear. No one comes near. Look at him working, darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. What does he care? Eleanor Rigby died in the church and was buried along with her name. Gosh, what a sad line.
Yes.
Nobody came. Father Mackenzie wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave. No one was saved. All the lonely people, where do they all come from? All the lonely people, where do they all belong? Now, that was written in the 1960s. So it must be really bad now.
It was very relevant then, as relevant today.
Well, as someone who's been in ministry for 40 years now, I must say your book is outstanding.
Thank you.
I was just overjoyed in reading it. As you say, loneliness ebbs and flows over the years as our circumstances change. And that's basically what my life has been like. The Lord called me to singleness, so I've never been married. And periodically this loneliness comes on me. And then when I get around people, it goes away.
But you can be lonely in a crowd.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I often am. I'll sit there with a big conference going on and knowing that people who are shaking my hand are doing so because I'm giving them something valuable. But do they really know me? Do they really care?
Is there a real solid connection with you?
Yeah.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah. So you begin your book with a quote from Trevor Hudson. I'd like to read it. He writes, loneliness comes mostly when we are disconnected from others in such a way that we feel ignored, overlooked, or not known as we really are. It is the painful ache in our hearts for intimate connection, belonging, and companionship. Mm-hmm. And to that you add, loneliness is a longing to be known, seen, touched, heard, and understood, to be wanted, enjoyed, and needed, to be valued and validated. Well, that's a tall order these days, isn't it?
It is. And we live in an age where we are so connected, but we're not really connected at the heart and the soul level. And we have lots of digital connections, but they do not substitute for real heart connections. And where people do see us and know us and understand us. There's an epidemic of loneliness. 54% of Americans feel like nobody knows them well. 44% feel alone. And it's not just in America. In Japan, they're having an epidemic of lonely deaths. Those are deaths where someone dies and no one knows about it until the neighbors smell the stench of the rotting body. It's tragic. And it's happened in Great Britain, where when Theresa May was the prime minister, she appointed a minister of loneliness to her cabinet. So it's a worldwide problem. We are lonely.
Will you give us a list of words that sometimes refer to loneliness and how they differ in one of your chapters? What's the difference between being alone, being lonely, and then there's circumstantial loneliness that you talk about, solitude and isolation? Talk about those.
Well, loneliness is usually transitory. It's not going to last. It is circumstantial. You can get out of it. But if it becomes persistent, then it leads into all sorts of disorders. It can lead to depression, lack of eating properly, those kinds of things, and it's not good for you. But then solitude is good for you. That's where we choose to be alone, to recalibrate, to talk with God, to understand a little bit more about who we are. And so that's good for us. Isolation is bad. Isolation, the Bible says that he who isolates himself is not wise. And in our society, isolation is considered the worst form of punishment that you can have, when you put somebody in solitary confinement. Yeah. So it's important to have a connection with people. God said it's not good for us to be alone, and it's not. We want to be with someone. We want to be with other people, but sometimes it's good to step back, and Jesus did, step back and have some solitude alone with God and alone with yourself. Sometimes it's just good to be alone.
Yeah. Well, how do people develop a lonely soul or spirit? I imagine for some it has to do with being unaffirmed and bullied and various things like that. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think rejection creates that. I think that it comes when we are not understood, not known. We feel totally cut off. And so that's when you get this lonely spirit, and it's very hard and very difficult to deal with, but it can be transformed. You know, we diagnose the problem, but it can be transformed. We want to give people hope that there is an opportunity to transform loneliness into something that God can use for your good and for the good of others.
When we feel ashamed of being lonely or even deficient, we don't tell anybody.
That's right. And I experienced that myself. I was doing research for this book, and I was reading books on loneliness, and I was going to a speaking engagement, and I was taking an airline flight. And so I took the book with me, and I began to pull it out of my bag, and it had loneliness in the title. And I thought, the man next to me is going to think I'm alone or I'm lonely. And I thought, I don't want anybody to know that. So I put it back in my bag. So we do attach a shame to it for some reason, but we shouldn't, because there's so many people are lonely. And I think once we confess we are lonely, we'll find out that a lot of people are lonely, and you'll find that you'll have company.
So how do you find out they're lonely? And then what do you do together to turn that around?
Well, I think when we confess that we're lonely, people find it much easier to confess that they're lonely. And I found that throughout life, that if I'm transparent about where I am, other people feel much more comfortable be transparent about where they are.
Yeah. And one fascinating thing in your book was you talked about God needing companionship. Talk about that.
Well, God did. He's always been in community. He was Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But when he was making us and creating us, he desired to have company. He desired to be in fellowship with his creation and his creatures. And so he went to the garden seeking Adam. He wanted to be with company, wanted to be with his creations, and he loves us. And even today, he loves us so much that he wants to gather us into his arms and be with us. And actually, he's with us all the time. When we have Jesus in our heart, he's with us all the time, and we have his company all the time. We are never really alone when we have Jesus.
And he understood all of this when he said that it wasn't good for man to be alone.
That's right. That's right.
And then Jesus, of course, was an expression of God's desire for companionship, yet he had some issues there too, right?
Oh, he spent some very lonely hours, especially on the cross and in the Gethsemane. And as he agonized whether he would go to the cross or not, he could have chosen not to go, but he agonized with that decision. And he finally submitted to the Lord's will, for God's will. And when he did, God sent an angel to minister to him. And I think the angel really comforted Jesus. And knowing what was lying ahead, perhaps Jesus, as a human, was so overwhelmed, he lost sight of the big picture. And so the angel was there to encourage him and keep his mind focused on what the big picture was, that this was the salvation for the whole world, for all time. And Jesus was human, and sometimes we don't think of that. We think of him as God, and he is, but he was still human, and he suffered and he agonized over things.
So he experienced what we experience in order for us to identify with him.
Yes. And of course, on the cross, he was very much alone when his father turned his face away.
Yeah. Imagine going through that. I mean, he'd been in perfect unity with the Godhead. And then there comes that moment when he senses that God has turned away in order to, for him to become sin, I guess was the reason, so that he could atone.
Exactly. Just I can't imagine the cosmic loneliness. I mean, we experience loneliness, but nothing like that. And for them to be separated, and God experienced loneliness, his son was not there anymore. And that had to be hard on God. But of course, God knew what he was doing, and he knew what was going to happen, and he knew what, the victory that was going to be won, but not easy. We have to realize that God is God, but Jesus was human as well.
I love the fact that you talked about the pain that the Father went through. I was, the Lord told me one time to start reading the crucifixion accounts and to meditate on those. So I did it a couple of weeks and wondering, why do I keep doing it? And I think God wanted to deeply impress in me what Jesus went through, so that it was more than just an intellectual thing. And so at the end of those 2 weeks, I'm wondering why we're continuing with this. And suddenly the pain of the Father swept into my heart. And I could feel the pain he had watching his son be crucified. Not only that, he could have stopped it. Imagine watching your child be crucified and you're able to stop it, but you don't. Can you imagine?
No, I can't. It's beyond imagination.
Yeah.
And the Father, the pain must have been excruciating.
It was, as I felt it, I couldn't even stand it. I mean, it was deep and very surprising to me. I had never considered the Father's pain before. Yeah. So we no longer live in community, even in the church. Why is that? What's going on there? Why have we chosen not to connect anymore, except online, maybe?
Well, of course, this pandemic has not helped us. People have gone online to watch church, and they're staying online instead of going and having fellowship. I hope it's a trend that will not last, because we still long for human connection. And I found it very interesting that during the pandemic, Verizon found that there were more cell phone calls, 800 million a day, more than Mother's Day, because people wanted to hear a voice. Wow. And we need to have a connection. And I'm hoping that people will really come to understand that digital stuff is not going to work. And I quote my grandson in the book, because Generation Z is the most lonely. And interestingly, the greatest generation is the least lonely. And I think it's because they learn to serve. And when we are serving others, we're not lonely. But my grandson said, we have all these connections, but nobody's really connecting on a heart level. And he said, it's scary. Yeah. And he's 25 years old.
I've never liked texting. I've always wanted people to actually call. And it just seems so impersonal when you're going back and forth that way.
It is.
Yeah. Now, you write in your book, you say in your book, Transforming Loneliness is the title of the book. I want to be awed by God's presence and power as he transforms my loneliness into a greater closeness with him and with others. How is that achieved?
Well, excuse me, you ask him first. I think it's so important to be honest with God and just say, God, I want to know you better. I'm feeling lonely. I don't like this loneliness, but can I know you better through this? Can I give you this loneliness? Honor God with your loneliness by giving it to him and saying, can you not work through this in my life so that I will know you better and understand you better? And God loves to answer prayers like that. He wants to be known by us.
Yeah. And I've noticed, especially when I pursue him first, when I try to develop that intimacy through worship, that's where I get most of my love experiences with God is through singing love songs to him. And then, of course, reading his word, he'll speak back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. And I think it's so important to be, I think worship is a big part. And I in the book, I talk about Abraham and how Abraham, as he was going up the mountain to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, I tend to think of Abraham trudging up with a heavy heart and just agonizing over this. But as I studied it and thought about it, I thought, no, he was dancing up the mountain because he knew that God could raise the dead. And so he knew that if Isaac did die, he could be raised from the dead. So he was anticipating what God was going to do. And he was excited. He was dancing up that mountain.
Wow. Wow. And I bet you he was leaping coming down.
Yes, he was, I'm sure. I hopefully get to see a video of it when we get to heaven.
Yeah. I've often wondered that. Is he going to let us watch history,
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. I want to see the creation. I want to see all of it.
Yeah. Well, in your book, you have a quote from Annie Lent. Let me read that for everybody. She says, the solution to loneliness is love. Specifically, the love of a good God who sees you, sympathizes with you, and possesses the power to do something about your loneliness. So love, really, that's a deeper dimension of the answer, isn't it?
Yes, yes. But it's the love of the Father and the love of Jesus. It's not a love that we manufacture ourselves. It's something that's bigger than that. It's that agape love.
Yeah. And it was demonstrated on the cross. I mean, it's unmistakable that it's there. I mean, it demonstrated in the creation itself and then the cross, of course. So two major demonstrations. Yeah.
Well, and in the book, we have a little acrostic, an acronym, I should say, REACH. Recognize the signs and symptoms of your loneliness. Express it to at least one other trusted person. Anticipate that God can transform it. REACH. Communicate with someone else, or connect with someone else. And you can connect through small group at church. You can connect through, just look around you at church and see somebody sitting alone and go sit beside them, connect with them. And then H, honor God by giving him your loneliness and say, God, I give this to you. Will you use it to honor you and to further for my good and others' good as well?
I think also personality and brain chemistry, where you have these outgoing people and then you have these introverts. I'm an introvert. And when I'm standing in church, especially a new church where I don't know anybody, and I know I should connect, I know I should go up and shake their hand and so forth, I just stand there frozen because I guess I'm so afraid of rejection.
It takes more energy for an introvert, and I'm an introvert as well. So it takes more energy. But I was explaining this to my grandson. He said, well, Mackie, they call me Mackie. How do you talk to so many people all the time? And I said, well, honey, I have some prepared questions in my mind before I even meet people. And for him, I was telling him, so ask them where they're from, what grade they're in, what are they interested in, what are they studying, those kinds of things. Have those prepared in your mind, and then you can start a conversation and stick your hand out first and say, hi, I'm so-and-so. And he said, I don't know if I can do that, Mackie. But I think we have to train ourselves to do that. But it can be tough. And when you walk into a crowded room by yourself, that's extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah. I have been doing that. I just started going to a new church, and I've been, people love to talk about themselves.
They do.
So what I do is I find out something they're really interested in, and then I ask them to talk at length about it. And I get a friend almost right away doing that.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
They do like to talk about themselves and what they're interested in, and that's fun.
Well, take us through some more of the ways that we can avoid or escape a life of loneliness, especially how God helps. What part does faith play in relieving the loneliness?
Well, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's when we have Jesus in us that we are never alone. And that's very important for us to recognize, that we are never alone when we have Jesus. We may feel lonely, but if we really understand Jesus and what he does for us and the scriptures, we know he said, I will never leave you. I'm with you always. So that's a promise we can count on. And during the pandemic, I've been reading the Old Testament prophets, and it's been interesting to me and sort of redundant to say, God does what he says he's going to do. And when God makes a promise, he keeps it. And it may take a long time to fulfill it, but he keeps his promise. And when he says he will never leave us, he never will. And he's with us always to the end of the age. And he is.
His timing is different, though. I know I have a great frustration when I pray sometimes, asking God questions and so forth, and not hearing an answer. I feel like he doesn't care, or I'm asking something that I don't know. That frustrates me. Every once in a while he'll speak back through a sermon or through something, and sometimes directly. I've had him speak back, not audibly, but in my heart directly. But most of the time, he's not a big talker.
Only through his word.
But when he does say something, it's life transforming.
Yes.
So I think it's the timing, really, of what I'm asking about, that may be.
And patience, patience with ourselves and patience with God, that God works on his timetable, not ours. And I'm like you, I get impatient. I want an answer now. But, when you commit something to the Lord in prayer, and wait long enough, it will come. And I've experienced that twice this year in a rather unusual way for me, and prayed about something and just didn't know whether I was supposed to do anything. And he revealed it to me in such a way. It was almost like he was audibly telling me, he was behind me. And what I had to say and what he told me was really important. And I was so grateful that he used me in that way, but I had to be patient.
When I was a young man, there was always a married couple in the church who would take me under the wing and have me over for dinner and so forth, invite me out. But as I got older, they sort of went away, because the interest was in helping a young person get started, I suspect. Mm-hmm. But the older you get, the lonelier you can get because of some of these things.
Well, and I said, like, the greatest generation is the least lonely because they learn to serve. And they're the least lonely until their health begins to fail, or they lose a spouse or their partner, life's partner. So then they become lonely. But it's the young people that are the loneliest, and because they have not learned to serve. And service in the church, if you go to the pastor and say, how can I serve? He will be all over you like white on rice. He will be so thrilled to have somebody volunteer. And that's a way to, not feel lonely.
Yeah. Well, I sometimes ask God to send me somebody who finds me interesting or cares about me or something, and he'll do that.
Mm-hmm. He will.
Yeah.
He loves to answer those kinds of prayers. Yeah.
And it's always somebody just perfect for me, somebody I am interested in, and somebody who lives a life that I can identify with in some way or another. Yeah,
God knows you very well. He will send you the right person. He knows me very well.
Too well sometimes. I suspect that some people experience loneliness as a result of personality disorders or arrested emotional development. It's like a whole separate angle to this issue. I guess psychological help is helpful in that, so that they lighten up and get rid of some of the roots of that personality disorder. Or what do you think about that?
Oh, I think that counseling can be invaluable. And I would recommend that to anybody who feels that they need the extra help. There's no question about that. And I think for years we thought that counseling meant that we were somehow spiritually deficient. But that's not true. God has provided wonderful counselors and wisdom that comes through their training that I think is that we need to take advantage of. So I don't think we need to be ashamed of that at all. I think we can embrace it and be grateful and thank the Lord for it.
You know, one of my favorite psychologists is Dr. Conrad Bars, who's not living at this point, but his daughter Suzanne is taking over his work. And he specialized in affirmation disorders. He called it affirmation neurosis. The most common deficiency in the world today, as far as I'm concerned. This is at the core of not only loneliness, but a lot of dysfunctional behavior, because a lot of people have never been affirmed by anyone. And when you're not affirmed, especially when you're growing up, it sort of fixes something in you that needs to be fixed.
Yes, I agree. I think the gift of encouragement is the most important gift. It just, just to encourage others along the way and affirm them. And I work real hard at doing that with people around me, because it's so important, and especially my children. I wrote my son, as a matter of fact, a letter this week, just a long letter, just telling him how proud I was of him and what I saw in him and how he'd overcome some challenges. And so I've just really appreciated him. And it's important for parents to do that for their children, especially, but for other people, for your pastor. Oh my goodness. They get criticized so often, but to affirm them and tell them that you appreciated the message and what you appreciated about the message. Affirm them. Encouragement is so important.
One of the solutions, in fact, the solution that Dr. Bars gave was because most people don't know how to help somebody who hasn't been affirmed, because the person who hasn't been affirmed doesn't really believe anybody cares. So when somebody tries to affirm them, sometimes they're thinking, if you only knew me, you wouldn't be saying those nice things. And he says, your approach to people needs to be affected. In other words, they need to see in your eyes that you really care, that you're not just saying something you should say, but that you really care. They need to see in your body language.
I agree. I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, so that's important.
And that's where hugs, and of course you have to be real careful today, but I think hugs are important, just to give somebody or touch them on the arm or, some way, let them connect with them physically. And again, we have to be very careful these days. But I think the human body needs to be touched.
Yeah. And science has proven that.
Yeah. And skin is the largest organ we have.
Yeah. One of the big causes of depression is not being touched, they say. Yeah. Well, what haven't I asked you about loneliness that you'd really like to communicate to the viewer and the listener?
I just would reiterate that acronym, REACH. Recognize that you're lonely and recognize the symptoms of your loneliness. Yeah. Tell somebody, express it to someone else. Anticipate that God will do something, transform it for you, and do something in your life to draw you closer to Him and to other people. And then connect with people. And however you want to connect, bird watching or book club or, whatever it is, buy a little dog and take it for a walk in the neighborhood. And you'll be amazed at how many people come out and talk to you. But connect with people and then honor God. Just say, God, here is my loneliness. Would you transform it so that I know you better and I get to know others better? And He will do that.
In my new church, there's a seniors group, and I'm now officially a senior at 70 years old. And they go out together, they watch movies together, and there's something in me that's afraid to go with them. I don't want people to see me as a senior citizen,
So but we are, I'm sorry.
Now it's kind of like you not wanting to read the book on the airplane.
That's right.
Now, let me tell people what the other chapters are in the book, because we haven't had time to go through them. The dark side of loneliness, I suppose that's about Satan, is it?
But not necessarily about Satan. It's about what it can do to us. What loneliness does to us.
Okay. And then you have the transformation of loneliness, which I guess we've talked about. The treasures of solitude, which a lot of people don't even know about.
No, but you think of David, who spent a lot of time by himself in the wilderness as a shepherd, and think of how he honed his skill with a slingshot when he was out in the wilderness, and he was preparing himself. God was preparing him to be a king, and all the songs that he wrote while he was out there, and he was able to slay a giant. He was prepared by his solitude. So they're treasures of solitude, no question about it.
Yeah, I'm one of those guys who loves solitude, even while I'm feeling lonely and knowing I've got to do something about it. Then you have the cultivation of solitude, the affirmation of being chosen, the comfort of being known, the security of belonging, the assurance of being loved, the purpose and the promise. I tell you what, I do so many interviews, so usually I can't read but half the book, but I'm going to read the whole thing on this one, because it's outstanding. I don't know if people can see it, but it's called Transforming Loneliness, Deepening Our Relationships with God and Others When We Feel Alone. Ruth, I'm so glad you came on to talk about this, because nobody's talking about it, and it's one of the most needed subjects there is to find help for.
Well, especially at this season.
Yeah, especially. Now, tell people again where they can go to find you, and what do you offer there, and so forth.
You can go to Ruth Graham Ministries, and if you want the book, you can go to Amazon, or you can go to Ruth Graham Ministries or ruthgraham.com. It's just very easy. So, but I think it's an important book. I really do. And I think that people will be looking at this book for years to come, because loneliness is such a serious subject.
Yeah, it is. Well, God bless you, Ruth. I'm so glad you came on.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Remember, much of Dr. Foster's teaching has been taken from his new book entitled Sexual Healing Reference Edition, available at our website, masteringlife.org. This podcast and our many other resources are available because of our donors. If you are one of them, thank you. If you would like to join in supporting us, please visit masteringlife.org.